the purpose of this presentation really is to take you through some of the pitfalls of being gluten-free, but most importantly, I really wanted you all to get a sense of why we ask you to be gluten-free in the first place. So let's first of all look at what gluten is. So it's a protein found in many grains, not just wheat, and it is predominantly made up of peptides called gliadin and glutenin. And it actually comes from the word, it's a Greek word meaning glue, and it's sticky and gluey. And it's this stickiness that we like in our bread because it gives it that elastic sort of chewy texture, and it also promotes the rising of the dough. And it has a coagulating action similar to egg white, but there's also, as you can see down the bottom there, the beautiful bread that we all like so much. And the reaction to gluten can be anything from celiac disease to a severe gluten sensitivity. And what we're finding out now is that more and more people are not just getting celiac disease, but they're getting severe reactions. Now, obviously, celiac is the predominant reaction. It's the most severe reaction, and it causes autoimmune destruction of the small intestine. And in 2008, Dr. Peter Green stated at the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma and Immunology that an estimated 1% of the population in the Western world now have celiac disease, but only 3% of those have actually been diagnosed. And if we put that into perspective, what we're talking about, for example, in the US, is that 320,000 people actually have celiac disease, but only 9,600 people know that they do. And that's pretty frightening when you consider what the side effects to being a celiac is. And the traditional concept is that celiac disease is just a gut disease, and that symptoms really only affect the mucosa in the gut, and that there's obviously malabsorption. But what we understand now through the research is that it's far more reaching than that. And there are many symptoms that occur outside the gut that really have quite significant impact on our health. And it can be neurological, like ataxia, so affecting the way that you walk, eczema, IBS, headaches, migraines. There's so many symptoms that we can get. And it does occur in genetically susceptible people, but we'll talk a bit more about that later on. But a gluten sensitivity is really an exaggerated immune response to gluten, and it leads to inflammation through the body, and eventually it can also cause an autoimmune disease. And that's common when we get any tissue that is seen to be a foreign body that our immune system then goes on to attack. So is it a fad? Well, there's so many fad diets, and the market for gluten-free food and beverages alone grew at a rate of 28% from 2004 to 2008. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think, yes, we do have a semi-increased awareness. I do think there are more products around that make it easier for people to be gluten-free. But I really think that the issues we've had and that people are getting generally is because the gluten is really not the gluten that our great-grandparents have been eating for thousands of years and theirs before them and then. And I think the best expert to review his research is Professor Alessio Fasano. And he won the Linus Paulding Prize for Medicine in 2012 in the work that he did on zonulin. And zonulin is a protein that really controls the permeability of these important tight junctions between cells of our digestive tract. And what he's shown is that the gliadin, which is that glycoprotein in wheat, actually activates zonulin. And the zonulin then leads to increased intestinal permeability. And so he believes that this is a big underlying issue with autoimmune disease, particularly in people that are genetically prone. And the trigger really is the gluten protein. And it sets off this aberrant immune response. And it's not just wheat, but it's also the proteins in barley and rye. They do the same things. And it's your genetic susceptibility that causes whether or not you will have this issue. And we then obviously see the side effects is the leaky gut, and then that has flow-on effects through the whole body. So when we look at how grains and particularly wheat has been agricultured over the last 10,000 years, in the past they were very different. And you can see there in the picture the evolution of the wheat grain. They do look different. And basically what they've done is they've taken two grains and made it into a new wheat. And although it's not technically genetically modified, it has been significantly hybridized and what we call deaminated. And this hybridization creates a brand new protein because it combines different strains of wheat, and that alters the protein sequence. And it's created a new wheat which is certainly more resilient, it's less susceptible to insects and pests and grows quicker. And so it's more likely to trigger an immune reaction, especially in the brain and the nervous system. And deamidation, which is used extensively in the food processing industry, has also made gluten more immune reactive. And I certainly know that our wheat in Australia is probably one of the best examples of this hybridized wheat that we have grown to be almost like a super wheat. And we, as a per capita, are reacting to gluten much higher than, say, those in France that still have that traditional sourdough culture that isn't using necessarily these new hybridized wheat, and it allows for more gluten to be broken down by using the traditional baking methods. So if we look, this is a really good picture to show the effect on the body that various triggers that release zonulin. For example, bacteria and gliadin from gluten, as we said, release zonulin. And it's this zonulin release that's a signal for these tight junctions to open. And this then causes us to have this leaky gut barrier. And so that large food proteins that should be confined to the gut are not, and they leak into the surrounding tissue and create a pro-inflammatory response. And because there's inflammation, there's cell damage, and we produce trans-glutaminase 2, and it's the IgA that's produced in response to this that really gives us these abnormal TG2. And so when the IgA attacks the TG2, we get decreased blood flow, the tissues get affected, and particularly in a celiac, that's when you will see the microvilli and the to be blunted and flattened, and that's why you get this reduction in absorption of your nutrients. And as we said, genes are obviously a big issue here. And in genetically susceptible individuals, it's those that really express the HLA DQ2 or DQ8. And there are various for those of you that have done your 23andMe, you can see there are various genes that affect celiac disease, but it's the HLA specifically that we're looking for. So if we have a look at the research, there's been a lot of research over the last few years, and this study from the Mayo Clinic shows that celiac disease affects, as we said before, 1% of the population, but this is mostly undiagnosed. And I think that's a big factor, because we often have patients that come in and say, well, I've seen my doctor and he doesn't think I need to go on a gluten-free diet, yet when they do, they improve significantly. And I just think there's a lack of knowledge out there, which is surprising given the work of Alessio Fasano, that there should be a lot of interest and a lot of awareness now that there are side effects of eating gluten. This study looked at the small amounts of gluten in people that were not actually celiacs, and they concluded that the intake of gluten significantly increased overall symptoms, bloating, pain, foggy mind, depression, those cuts that you get around your mouth. They were all mouth ulcers. They were all attributed to just normal, everyday people eating gluten and not necessarily being a celiac. In this study, gluten is linked to neurological disorders, and they showed that there were increases in these transglutaminase 6 antibodies in schizophrenia patients who had no digestive symptoms at all. And so I think it's important that we don't just look at a gluten reaction as something that is only going to affect the gut, because we know now that, and this is a 2012 study, that the neurological effect is quite significant. And these transglutaminases are not only found in the intestinal tract, but they're also found in the skin. So it's very common to get skin outbreaks. And it's also found in the nervous system through these TG6s. And this study looked at the celiac disease and how the destruction we always thought is limited to the intestinal tract, but certainly the neurological symptoms are quite significant. And you can see there that it's everything from nervous system issues, ataxia, which is cerebellar ataxia, which is not being able to get a good footing on the floor, hypertonia, developmental delay, learning disorders, depression, migraine, headache. So we've got to be thinking outside the gut when we think about gluten. And this was a really interesting study that looked at how gluten really attacks the nervous system. And it's these GAD antibodies that we rely on to produce GABA, but there is almost an autoimmunity to these GAD antibodies and GAD, so therefore your GABA production is not as good as it can be, and so you become more reactive to, for example, high glutamic acid type foods, and we see that in a lot of patients. And when you have these GAD antibodies, you're more likely to have symptoms related to anxiety. But when you take the gluten away, they certainly are so much better. So when we look at it in perspective of MTHFR, apart from the fact that most breads have folic acid in it, and we are trying to avoid folic acid, and most packaged foods have folic acid, if we put that aside, we know that a lot of people with MTHFR already have neurological symptoms. They have brain fog. A lot of them have problems thinking clearly. They have headaches. They have migraine. Their immune system is compromised often because of ongoing viruses and bacteria. So it's not inconceivable to think that these people already do have a zonulin release and therefore are more likely to have the opening of these gap junctions. Therefore, any gluten is going to make it worse. A lot have digestive disturbances because of high ammonia, because of nitric oxide synthase dysregulation. and therefore that in itself will also affect gut. There's a lot of chronic fatigue, and certainly we know anyone with a gluten sensitivity is going to present with fatigue. As I said, neurological function and hormonal dysfunction. So if we then add the possibility of a gluten sensitivity on top of that, then we're adding to the problem. And that's why we really need to be aware of some of the symptoms and signs of gluten sensitivity. So here we look at celiac disease, and this is by no means the only list. There's a lot more, but these are the key: abdominal pain, weight loss, headaches and migraine, foggy mind, fatigue, diarrhea, etc., etc. But if you look at the signs, and these are some of the skin reactions that you can get from gluten. And so I think you've got to look at not only, as we said, these transglutaminase antibodies are in the skin and will give reactions like this. If you look at the signs and symptoms of gluten sensitivity, you actually see that it's pretty much the same as the celiac. And it can be linked with everything from dementia, restless leg syndrome, numbness, tingling, hearing loss, seizures. It's quite significant when you look at the effects. So let's have a look at some of the foods that we need to avoid. And I think this is where a lot of people get very confused. So the gluten-containing grains are wheat. Now, that also includes couscous, farro, wheat germ, garum flour, and semolina, which are all made from wheat. Rye, barley, including barley malt, spelt, kamut, oats, and often the problem with oats is that they are crop rotated with gluten-containing crops. And so you're not actually getting a clear, particularly with celiac disease, that's not a good one. But you can buy gluten-free oats. Triticale is also another one. And predominantly we're finding gluten in anything that's in a packet, essentially: bread, pasta, cereals, cakes, biscuits. So we've got to be really careful in what we are and are not eating. And there are foods that have what we call a cross reaction to gluten, which means that for some people, going gluten-free just isn't enough to help brain function or their autoimmune condition or their inflammatory condition. And there are some foods that cross-react with gluten, and what this means is that the proteins in these foods are similar enough to those in gluten that the body sees it as gluten. And casein and corn are probably the most common ones, but also oats, some brands of instant coffee, yeast, and sesame. The hidden sources of gluten, and this is where it gets quite depressing because pretty well everything has gluten. And I think one thing that a lot of people forget about is alcohol, because beer is brewed with malted grains. And hops, barley, rye, they're all beers are made from that. So we have to be really careful. You can actually get some gluten-free beer now in Australia. Barley grass, bran, brewer's yeast, because again it's used in making beer, and the brewer's yeast is more likely to have gluten. Modified food starch, any food emulsifiers, stabilizers, food coloring, malt extract, malted milk, malt vinegar, dextrins, which is very common, food additives, and pretty well any sauce: tomato sauce, mustard, salad dressings, processed meat like salami, soy sauce, kisap manis, which is an Indonesian sweet soy, even things like the imitation crab meat that's inside sushi rolls. French fries are often coated with gluten. Carob usually contains barley. Things like roti, gravy, and sauces all have some element of gluten, and you've really just got to check all the packets. The others are disodium, another food additive. The second one there, disodium wheat german, is used in the cosmetic industry, and we have to look at our personal care products, because even shampoos do have gluten in it, and that's particularly important for those people that are celiac. Licorice sweets are usually wheat-based. Miso usually contains wheat or barley. Rice malt, if barley is used. Sauces, as we said, teriyaki, and is wheat-based. Soba noodles. So if you get 100% buckwheat noodle from a Japanese supermarket, that's great. But most soba noodles in the supermarket are a combination of buckwheat and gluten and wheat. Stock cubes, unless it says gluten-free, usually do have gluten. Tabbouleh is made from wheat. Tea, so some teas have flavouring, which does have gluten, believe it or not. Tempeh may contain gluten-containing flavourings. Tofu, udon noodles, and of course all our vitamins and supplements we need to double check. So the things that you can eat, and some of you will be surprised to see that the list is actually quite large. So you can have corn, unless of course you cross-react with this. Corn is also maize, it's also polenta. Rice, brown and white. Any of the nut flours, so almond flour, hazelnut flour, cashew nut flour, pistachio nut flour, any of the nut flours. And for those of you that have a Thermomix, it's really easy to make that yourself, and you can just put it in there and mix it up in a few seconds. Quinoa, it's very high in protein, as is amaranth. Arrowroot flour, so it's the root of the plant, it's really good for thickening sauces. Artichoke flour, so those of you that live near Thomas Ducks or any of the better health food shops about life, they have a lot of these flours. Besan flour is actually chickpea flour. It's also called garbanzo bean flour. You can get buckwheat, cashew, chia seed, coconut, corn, cornmeal, polenta, maize, cornstarch, fava bean, flaxseed, guar gum, millet, oats only if it's certified gluten-free. You can get pea flour, plantain, potato, pumpkin seed, and the list goes on. So there are a lot of different flours that you can use, and you can make a lot of these yourselves if you have a really good food processor. The other ingredients that are okay that people often ask us about is acacia gum, azuki beans. In fact, any of the beans are usually gluten-free unless they're in a tin. You've got to be careful. Agar, which is a natural gelatin, agave, beans and lentils, coconut. So coconut sugar is fine, coconut flour is fine, coconut milk is fine. Cassava, which is another root vegetable. Cocoa, coconut, dates, eggs, and etc. So any of those are fine to use. Some suggestions. So I've given you a resources page at the end of this, which has got a lot of these recipes. One of the best sites that I've found is thehealthychef.com. It's Teresa Cutter, and she has a fantastic array of really great gluten-free recipes. So, for example, she's got a chia porridge with pear, cinnamon and vanilla. And what I like about the Healthy Chef site is it's all broken down under recipes, under breakfast, lunch, dinners, snacks, smoothies, and the recipes, I've made a lot of them and they're great tasting. We can have, for example, a gluten-free toast with a poached or scrambled egg. Now, gluten-free toast is really not gluten-free toast in that there's a lot of very, very highly processed ones that are pretty well no better than eating a bit of cardboard. So it is important to buy the better ones. For example, a buckwheat toast, or you can get good pumpkin and grain toast now. But I think it's important not to get the really highly processed rice ones. And a lot of them also have soy flour, lots of soy flour. So be careful with the soy flour. It's a very highly reactive ingredient, and we want to try and eliminate that, particularly as a lot of it is genetically modified. Gluten-free mueslis, you can make your own at home really easily. Buckwheat pancakes, so the Orgran, Orgran brand that you can buy in the supermarket are great because it's all pretty well gluten-free. Well, it is all gluten-free, but a lot of it is also soy-free, sugar-free, and they do a great buckwheat pancake mix, which would be great for kids, and you can make your own stewed apple or stewed fruit and put it on top. Spinach and tomato omelette, for example, any omelettes are great. Any eggs are great as long as you don't have a reaction to eggs. Even a nut milk smoothie with berries and a rice protein powder or a pea protein powder would be good start to the breakfast for those of you that don't like to sit down and have a big breakfast. Homemade baked beans on gluten-free toast, coconut and banana bread. And for lunch, some ideas, you can have a salad with any protein you like. Chicken and vegetable soup now that we're getting into the winter months. Chicken burger, the Healthy Chef have fabulous recipe for chicken burger, and you'll probably end up making a couple of batches because they're really good. Chili con carne with some corn chips and avocado would be a great lunch. Zucchini pasta is probably my favourite, and one of my patients actually put me on to the spiralator that you can buy online. And I pretty well only use zucchini pasta at home now. I don't even use gluten-free pasta, and I love it. We've also got, you could have green pea fritters with salmon, rice paper rolls with prawn or chicken, easy to make yourself, but for those of you who are on the go, obviously the Japanese is a great, because it's primarily gluten-free unless you put lots of soy sauce in there. A spinach and ricotta pie, for example, Thai fish cakes. I mean, the list goes on. And dinner, Teresa Cutter has a great massaman curry with rice, zucchini pasta with spaghetti bolognese, the chicken burger, again, chili con carne, steak. So pretty well you're fine with any meats, chicken, fish, beef, lamb, pork, any of those are fine, and any of your vegetables are fine. Roast chicken and vegetables, grilled salmon, pesto and a salad, beef casserole with vegetables, Thai fish cakes, any risottos are fine. So I guess the important thing is that most people will come and say, oh, look, I'm mostly gluten-free. But I think what we need to do is look at, you can't be most. You either need to be all or nothing, because even for some people, a teaspoon of gluten can cause a severe reaction. And I had one patient who literally can have a teaspoon of something and she will be on the toilet for probably 12 hours straight. It's not fun, but it does show you the severe reaction that some people get, and she's not celiac. And as we said, it doesn't have to be a gut reaction. It can certainly be a neurological one. So here's some resources that will be of interest to you, particularly the gluten-free. We have a gluten-free handout, which there's the link there, and that will give you a lot of the Australian products that you can buy at the supermarket or the health food shop that are gluten-free. There's some recipe sites there. My favourite is certainly the Healthy Chef and Quirky Cooking, and I noticed that Jamie Oliver is also, he's got some gluten-free recipes there as well. So there's some more resources. I hope you have fun trying to cook those. But I would highly recommend Quirky Cooking and Healthy Chef because their gluten-free recipes are really creative, really easy, and they taste great. Okay, so I think we've got some time for questions now, and I think there are a couple there. So I'll see if I can. Do you want to ask the questions, Lauren?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first question, will I be able to eat gluten-containing products occasionally in the future once my health has improved?
If your health improves from being gluten-free, then I would say that you may not. I mean, what we're looking for is, why did you get the health issues in the first place? Could it have been the gluten that set off the leaky gut that then compromised your immune system, that then added to the fatigue and everything else. Some people, if they have it by accident, they don't respond, and that's really what we want. We don't want any severe reactions. But for some people, no, it's going to be a lifelong adherence to a gluten-free diet, because it could have well been the gluten that affected their health in the first place.
Okay, and you mentioned sesame. Does that mean that we need to avoid tahini?
For those people who have a cross-reactivity, which means that they do react to some of the others, then yes. So some people, when you remove gluten from their diet, they get significantly better, they improve, and they will turn around really quickly and say, wow, I just can't believe how much better. But for some people that have reaction, particularly when you can see it in a food sensitivity test, you can see that they're reacting to corn and they're reacting to sesame. And I would say those people are showing a cross-reactivity. And so, yes, sesame oil, sesame seeds, tahini would need to be avoided.
Okay, one of our listeners, Kerry, has MS and the MTHFR gene mutations, and she asked if she should be avoiding gluten.
Absolutely.
With the MS.
Absolutely, 100%, yes. Because MS is an immune compromised health issue, and we know, and you've seen from today, that your immune system is hugely affected by eating gluten in those that are susceptible.
Okay, thanks. Laurie has an IgG immunodeficiency and is asking, is it possible that he won't have antibodies to gluten?
The biggest issue that we need to look at with that is the straight antibody test that you do through the doctor, through the blood test, will not necessarily pick up your gluten antibodies, because we are now seeing, and there's some fantastic tests in the States that are not yet available here in Australia, that pick up a lot more than what they would normally do. So, for example, we can now pick up these transglutaminase 2, 3 and 6, and we also need to look at the deamidated gliadin, the gamma gliadin, the omega gliadin and the alpha gliadin, and they're not doing that in these typical tests that you get through your bloods. So it would be unlikely, but I would probably like to see the genes as well, to see if there is an IgA response as well and an IgG in the genes. And if there is, and particularly with the HLA, I think anyone, if you go back to that photo of the genes, that if you have a HLA response at all, then you really need to be getting rid of the gluten. And a lot of people have the HLA DQA2 and they're not celiac, but they will come in and say, I really cannot eat gluten. So that's a bit of a tough question to answer without seeing some of the signs and symptoms, Laurie. But certainly I think if you do react, then hopefully we'll get these Cyrex Labs tests here in Australia, and I think that would be really good for you to do.
Okay, and Kelly asked whether there's any bread she can have. She has vitiligo and has struggled with memory for a long time, and dementia is in the family.
Okay,
and she was wondering if she could eat any bread again.
If it's gluten-free bread, yes, you can. But vitiligo is, it's definitely I believe, a subsection of the whole methylation cycle, because it is affected by melanin, and your tyrosine hydroxylase has a big impact on that. And I think, again, it's an immune reactive health condition, and therefore you should not be eating gluten-based bread. And I would say in that environment you should also look and eliminate the cross reactivity grains as I would with Kerry, who has MS.
Okay, thank you. Could an itchy and irritated scalp be due to a gluten reaction?
Most definitely. I think when we consider that we've got these transglutaminases that represent in the skin, itchy scalp, there's a variety of different things. I would think histamine, I would think gluten, I would think food sensitivity predominantly. But yes, particularly if there's any other eczema or psoriasis or anything like that, I think psoriasis presents mostly initially in the scalp, and so I would be wanting to know whether it is an eczema or whether it is a psoriasis. And if it's psoriasis, I'd say definitely gluten's probably having a big part to play in that. But I would look at eliminating the gluten and see if the itchiness in the scalp improves.
Okay. And if we have MTHFR gene mutation, are you able to eat sourdough?
No, because sourdough, unless you are making it at home, the sourdough is still going to be made with commercial bread flour, and commercial bread flour will have folic acid in it. And so it's the folic acid that we know has a big problem with this DHFR gene that stops the folate being converted. So when we pull folate into the cell, we rely on our folate receptor, but it's the DHFR gene that really is responsible for ensuring that that folate gets metabolized. But folic acid has an inhibitory response on that gene. And so anything that's made with commercial bread flour, by law, has to be fortified with folic acid. So that's why we say no bread, because you're also having folic acid.
Okay, and are there any gluten-free bread brands without folic acid that you're aware of?
Okay, so that's a good question. The general rule of thumb is this: the independent bakeries and the organic bakeries, as a rule, do not put folic acid in it. But it is entirely up to them, because they don't have to comply with the commercial flour regulations of having folic acid. It is up to the individual bakery. So, for example, what's the brand of bread? Any of the organic breads will not have it on. But if they do put it in, they have to say it by law on the label. So if you look at any of the labels, if you're just going to a little bakery and you're seeing that it's it doesn't have a packet or anything with a labelling on it, I'd be a bit more circumspect. But certainly anything that you buy at a health food shop or buy from the gluten store online, then you certainly would check the labels, but it would be unlikely that they would put folic acid in it.
Okay, and Kay had a smart DNA test done about 2 years ago and is wondering whether she'll need to get a 23andMe follow-up.
Not necessarily, Kay. The smart DNA certainly looks at some, but not all of the methylation. Certainly it doesn't give us the same response that we get from the 23andMe, and then putting it through the MTHFR Support variant report. However, you should be able to pick up enough. It does do the MTR, MTRR, CBS, COMT, and MTHFR genes. And it does give you, I think from memory, the celiac response. So it would at least give you inflammatory markers and the key things that we need to work with. So I would think no, not in the short term.
Robert has been having Helga's soy and linseed gluten-free bread. Do you think that's okay?
Look, I actually don't. Sorry to say that, because it has got soy. And soy flour is probably one of the most genetically modified ingredients on the planet now. And I think when you consider that a lot of the soy is also sprayed with glyphosate and pesticides, and on top of that it's genetically modified, I don't think it's the best thing to be having, particularly as a flour. And so I don't recommend that for that reason. But one of the resources that I think we'll send to everyone that I forgot to put on the resources page is the gluten-free shop online, and we'll send that out to you. It's a really good resource. You can get a lot of organic gluten-free breads delivered to your home, and the Sol, S-O-L brand, I really like because they don't necessarily use a lot of grains. They use things like pumpkin and they use a little bit of rice, but it's predominantly low reactive grains, which I like.
Okay, and do you have any recommendations what the best flour would be to put in a Thermomix?
To make your own?
Yes.
Oh, well, quite frankly, anything at all. You can buy organic buckwheat grains, you can put them in the Thermomix and make buckwheat flour instantly. You can put organic white rice and make instantly. You can put any gluten-free grain at all and make it in 1 minute. You can also do activated nuts if you feel that way inclined, or buy organic nuts and you can just put it in the Thermomix and literally within 1 minute you will have a flour. The Thermomix works exceptionally well because it's so high speed and so strong that you get this really, really fine powder that you're unlikely to get with other mixes. So the Vitamix may also do it, but I haven't got one, so I'm not quite sure. But literally anything that you can buy as a seed or a grain, so you could even make chia flour if you wanted to, and that they're absolutely brilliant. I don't think there's any limitation to what flour you can make in the Thermomix.
Okay, thanks. And the last question, do you know if chewing gum contains gluten?
Some does, yes, some does. So again, you're going to have to look at the packet, but some definitely does. I don't know. I'm not a chewing gum chewer, so I don't know which ones would and wouldn't, but you definitely need to look in the label.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn.
Okay, thanks everybody. We'll let you know our next webinar, which will be in June, so please join us for that.